She had 2 shells, 3 starving children, and a stranger crawling through the snow toward her porch. She could have pulled the trigger. Nobody would have blamed her. Instead, she did something that changed everything. She lowered the gun. What happens next will remind you what real strength actually looks like. This channel is home to stories of the Wild West, where love is hard-earned, mothers are unbreakable, and strangers sometimes become the family you never knew you needed. The lesson: the bravest thing you'll ever do isn't pulling the trigger. It's choosing mercy when you have every reason not to. If this kind of story speaks to you, hit like, drop your city in the comments, share this with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next.
She trudged through the snow, sinking to her knees with every step. The wind bit right through her thin dress. He was face down, no coat, his shirt frozen stiff with blood. She nudged his boot with her own. Nothing. She kicked harder. "Mister?" His back hitched with a small breath. She rolled him over. His face was gray as ash, lips blue. An old white scar split his left eyebrow. His eyes opened, empty. "Get up," Clara said. "I am not about to carry you." His mouth worked, but no sound came. "I said get up. If you die on my land, I have to dig a grave in frozen ground, and I do not have the strength for that." A flicker of life returned to his eyes. He tried to push himself up, collapsed, then tried again, making it to his knees where he swayed. Clara got her shoulder under his arm, the dead weight of him nearly buckling her legs. She dug in her heels and hauled him toward the house. Her boots slid on the ice and they both fell sideways, but she grabbed a porch post to stop their slide. The door creaked open. It was Hannah, all of 12 years old, her face set hard. "Mama, no." Grab his other arm. He could be one of Hard Grow's men. Hannah Grace now. Hannah's jaw was tight, but she grabbed his other arm. Together they dragged him inside, his body hitting the floorboards like a sack of feed. Clara slammed the door and threw the bolt home. Her hands were shaking so bad she had to lean the shotgun against the wall. Near the bed, 8-year-old Sam stood with his daddy's hammer gripped tight, eyes fixed on the stranger. "Put that down, Sam." "No, ma'am." Clara saw her son, the heavy hammer, the way he planted his feet just like his daddy Jim used to when a coyote got near the hens. Her throat went tight. She swallowed hard. "Fine. Keep it. Just stay by your sister." Ellie let out another one of those deep, rattling coughs from the bed. The kind no remedy could touch. The stranger's blood was melting into a dark stain on her floor. "He's bleeding bad," Hannah said, her voice flat. Fear had left Hannah a long time ago. Clara knelt and lifted his torn shirt. It was a nasty gash, 6 inches long, torn by something jagged. The skin around it was hot with fever, even as the rest of him was cold as ice. She looked at Hannah. "Get the cloth strips and the water from the pot. We're wasting water on him." "That water is for Ellie's tea, Hannah." "I will melt more snow for her. Now go." Hannah stomped away. Clara pressed her hand to the wound to slow the bleeding. The man's body jerked and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes flew open. Clara didn't even flinch. She just stared right back at him. "Let go of my arm." His eyes were wild, like a spooked horse. "Mister, you are in my house. My children are watching you. Let go of me right now." The wildness in his eyes faded. His fingers uncurled from her wrist. "Sorry," his voice was all gravel. "Sorry, ma'am. Do not call me ma'am. I am not old enough to be a ma'am." "What do I call you?" "Clara." "Clara," he repeated, then closed his eyes. "I'm Eli." "Eli what?" "Did you leave your last name out in the snow?" "Just Eli." A man with half a name was hiding a whole lot more. Clara knew about hiding things like the $85 debt notice in her drawer that might as well have been $800. Hannah returned with the cloth and warm water. Clara cleaned and bound the wound with strips from her own petticoat. Eli never made a sound. He just stared at the ceiling, a man who knew pain all too well. You will live, she told him. The wound is ugly, but it is not a killing one. Much obliged. Do not thank me yet. This storm could last for days. I have 2 logs left for the fire, a little flour, and 3 children to feed. You are just one more mouth I cannot provide for. He turned his head to look at her. I will not eat your food. Oh, you will. Or you will die on my floor, and I already told you I am not digging any graves. A hint of a smile touched his lips, but died before it formed. From the bed, Ellie coughed again, a long, body-shaking spell. Sam laid a small hand on her back. He had put the hammer down to comfort his sister. Seeing that, just about broke something inside Clara. Your girl, Eli said, his gaze on the bed. How long has she been sick? 3 weeks. It gets worse every day. You got any willow bark? I used the last of it a week ago. He fell silent, his eyes fixed on Ellie. There's willow down by the creek, south of here, he said quietly. Maybe a quarter mile. Clara ignored him and went to the bread tin. Inside was one hard 3-day-old piece of bread. She broke it into 4 pieces, 3 bigger ones for the children and 1 small piece for herself. Sam took his and put a corner of it into Ellie's mouth. The last small piece sat in Clara's hand. Eli watched her from the floor, his eyes tracking the bread like it was his last hope. Do not, he rasped. That is yours. I know what it is. She placed the bread on the shelf above his head, where he could reach it. Then she turned her back to him and went to the stove. She did not need to watch him take it. After a long silence, she heard the quiet crackle of hard bread being chewed, slow and careful. The fire popped, and the weak heat it gave off was not enough. It was never enough. Night fell like a lamp being blown out. The wind howled and the cabin walls groaned. Clara sat by the stove, her knees drawn up where she could see the whole room. Eli was awake. She could tell from his breathing. You ought to sleep, she said. Is it the pain, he asked. No, just thinking. About what? About a woman who would point a shotgun at a man 1 minute and drag him into her house the next. Do not make it out to be more than it was. I would have done the same for a stray dog. No, you would not have. Clara looked at him across the dark room, the firelight catching the scar on his face. You do not know me, she said. I know you split your last piece of bread 4 ways and kept none for yourself. You were counting. I count things. The room was silent, save for the hissing fire and Ellie's soft cough. Sam stirred in his sleep, and my hand went to his back without even thinking. That little girl needs a doctor, Eli said from the floor. The doctor is 12 miles off in town, and the roads are snowed in. We do not have a horse. What happened to your horse? My jaw got tight. I sold it. Back in October. A man named Harrove raised the tax assessment on my land. I owed $42 by January 15th, and the horse only brought in $20. How much have you saved up? That is none of your business. No, it is not. The wind howled outside. $18, I said, not knowing why. Sometimes a stranger is the easiest person to tell your troubles to. 2 years of hard work for $18, and I owe $42 in taxes and another $85 on a banknote my husband took out before he passed. That $127 debt sat there between us in the dark. This Harrow fellow, Eli said, he is the one buying up all the land around here, is he not? My head snapped toward him. How did you know that? I passed 2 empty homesteads on my way here. Good land, fences still up. Looked like somebody left in a hurry. Nobody just walks away from good land. They get pushed. I just stared at him. Here was a man who was half dead an hour ago, yet he was sharp enough to notice abandoned farms in a blizzard. Who are you? I asked. I told you, Eli. That is not what I am asking. He shut his eyes. I know what you are asking, and I'm not ready to give you an answer. You are on my floor, patched up with pieces of my petticoat, eating food my children could have eaten. I know, he said. Then you owe me an answer. I do. He opened his eyes. But you will not get it tonight. I watched him for a long spell as the fire died down. His breathing became even, but I knew he was not asleep. We were just two people wide awake in the dark, each carrying a weight too heavy to set down. I thought of that notice from Harov. January 15th was only 6 weeks away. And I thought about Harov at church, smiling at me like a man does at something he already owns. Then I thought of my Jim. How I found him at the bottom of that old mine shaft, frozen solid, his hand reaching up like he was trying to come back home to me. I pulled him out myself and dug his grave while the children watched. Now a stranger was on my floor, and I had spent my last bit of kindness on him. The fire burned out and the cabin grew cold. Just before dawn, a noise woke me. Eli was sitting up, turned away from me, fiddling with something. The last glow from the embers caught a piece of metal in his hands. He turned it over and over before slipping it back into his shirt. In that flash of light, I saw it plain as day. It was a gold watch, a heavy, fancy thing with carving on it. The kind of watch that was worth more than this land and everything on it. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut before he could see I was awake, my heart pounding in my chest. A drifter would not be carrying a watch like that. A poor man would not have something so valuable. I lay there in the cold dark, listening to him settle back down. But one question just kept turning over in my mind. Who was this man, Eli? And what was a fella with that kind of gold doing nearly dead in a blizzard, showing up at a poor widow's cabin? I did not get any more sleep after that. I just pretended, while the image of that gold watch burned in my mind. A man with a watch like that was not lost. He was not a drifter. He was not anything he pretended to be. Dawn came gray and slow. I could just make out his shape on the floor. He was already awake, sitting up and watching me. I kept my eyes mostly shut, peeking at him through my lashes. He stood up slow and stiff, steadying himself on a shelf. His hand grazed the bread tin, paused, but he did not open it. He moved quietly to the stove, looked at the dead coals, then at the last 2 logs stacked beside it. I watched him count them. I saw the moment he understood what 2 logs meant to a family of 4 in a storm. He closed the firebox without lighting a fire and unbolted the door. The cold blast made him shudder, but he stepped outside and pulled the door shut tight behind him, trapping the little bit of heat we had left inside. "Where is he going?" my daughter Hannah whispered from across the room. "I do not know." "Good," she said. "Maybe he will keep right on going." I got up and looked through the frosted window. He was limping toward the trees, one arm pressed to his side where he was hurt. He got to the pines and started snapping dead branches right off the trunks. He was gathering firewood. I watched him for a good 10 minutes. He moved slow, but he did not stop, testing each branch and stacking the dry ones in his good arm. When he had a full load, he brought it to the porch, set it down neatly, and went right back for more. By the time he came back inside, his shirt was soaked, and his lips were blue, but he carried enough wood to last us 2 days. He stacked it by the stove and built a new fire, careful and smart. The flames caught and warmth began to fill the room again. I was standing by the bed holding Ellie. The fever had come back fierce in the night. Her little cheeks were flushed red and her eyes looked glassy. Eli saw her and stopped what he was doing. "How bad is she?" he asked. "The fever is much worse. I have to get to the creek," he said, pulling on his boots, "for the willow bark. But the storm is not over." "It is letting up," he said. "I have got about 4 hours. How can you possibly know that?" "I have spent 20 years reading the weather." He did not say where. He went to the door and put his hand on the bolt. "I will be back in 2 hours. If I am not, do not come looking for me. Just keep the fire hot and the girl warm. You will tear that wound open walking in this snow. Probably. You will bleed to death. Probably not. That is not very comforting." He looked back at me. It was not meant to be. And then he was gone. "He is crazy," Hannah said from the bed. "Maybe he is. Nobody goes out in a blizzard for some tree bark." "He is doing it," I said. "But why?" I held Ellie closer as she whimpered. "I do not know why." My boy Sam came and stood beside me holding his daddy's hammer. "Should I go with him?" "No, sweet boy. Your daddy would have gone." My throat got tight. I knelt and pulled Sam close. Your daddy would have told you to stay here and protect your sisters. That is your job now." Sam nodded, all serious, and went to sit by Ellie, the hammer laid across his knees, standing guard just like his father would have taught him. An hour went by. The fire burned bright with the wood Eli had gathered. I tried to feed Ellie some thin gruel, but she could not keep it down. Her cough was deeper now, a hollow sound that scared me. Hannah sat at the table, mending a sock with angry, stabbing motions. "Mama," she said, "that man is not who he says he is." I looked at my daughter. "He has not said much of anything." "Exactly," she said, biting the thread. "A real drifter talks your ear off, tells you his whole life story to make you feel sorry for him. This one, he does not talk. He does not explain himself. But he makes himself useful. That is different." I sat down across from her. "How is it different?" "A man who makes himself useful is a man who plans to stay." Her words hit me hard. I thought about the neat stack of firewood, the perfectly built fire, the way he understood what 2 logs meant. "You are only 12 years old," I said. "How do you know such things?" Hannah stopped her sewing. She looked right at me with her father's eyes, eyes that were too old for her face. Because that is what Daddy did the first time he came to Grandpa's house. He did not say much. He just fixed the porch rail and split a cord of wood. And then he waited. Clara just stared, her words caught in her throat. The cabin door blew open and Eli stumbled in with a gust of winter. His arms were loaded with strips of white willow bark, and a dark red stain was spreading across his shirt where the bandage had given way. His face was pale as a ghost, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He went right to the stove. "Get me a pot of boiling water," he ordered, his hands shaking as he broke the bark into small pieces. The steam that rose carried a bitter medicinal smell, a smell of desperation and hope. "Let it steep for 10 minutes, he said, his voice raspy. "Any longer and the girl won't be able to keep it down." "How did you know that?" He slumped to the floor, all his strength gone. "Lost 40 head of cattle one winter to a fever." Blood was now seeping between his fingers. "A man learns what the land can give him." Clara froze. A drifter didn't own 40 head of cattle. She knelt beside him. "Let me see that wound." "You went and tore it open," she said, seeing the fresh blood welling up after she peeled back the soggy bandage. "Figured I might," he grunted, his gaze fixed on little Ellie shaking on the bed. "But I went anyway." Clara cleaned the wound again and wrapped it twice as tight, pulling hard enough to make him hiss. "You keep this up. You'll be the one with the fever. Then I'll have 2 people dying on my floor." His eyes met hers. "Nobody's dying. We can fight this." A little later, Clara carried a cup of the willow tea to Ellie. The child barely stirred as Clara lifted her head. "Drink, baby," she whispered. Across the cabin, Sam watched his sister with wide eyes. "Is the medicine going to work?" he asked, his voice small. Eli, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, answered him directly. "It'll work, son. By tonight, her fever will start to break," Eli continued, his voice full of a strange certainty. "You promise?" Sam asked. For a second, Eli hesitated, the weight of a promise to a worried child heavy in the air. "I promise," he finally said. Sam gave a single nod and went back to his sister's side. As Clara watched Eli watch her son, she saw a flicker of raw pain on his face before he shut it away. "Don't look at my boy like that," she said softly. "Like what?" he asked, his jaw tight. "Like you're seeing a ghost." He looked away. "I had a younger brother, same age as your boy when I lost him." The afternoon wore on, and Ellie's breathing began to ease. The tea was working. Eli sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a small, worn-out knife, the shavings piling up at his feet. "You know a lot about cattle," Hannah said suddenly from across the room. It was not a question. Eli's knife stopped moving. "I know some." "You said you lost 40 head. That's more than some. That's a whole herd." He finally looked up. That was a long time ago, up in Montana. Hannah's eyes narrowed. You're smart, Eli said, looking right at her. You want to know if I'm a dangerous man. Hannah didn't even blink. Are you? Not to y'all, he said. But that's not a no, she shot back. No, he admitted, the honesty of it filling the small cabin. It ain't. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've fought men, and I've made choices that cost good people. But I have never in my life hurt a woman or a child, and I don't plan on starting in the home of the woman who saved my life. After a long silence, Hannah stood up, walked to the flour tin, and began mixing a small batch of biscuit dough. You can have 2, she said without looking at him. Eli watched her for a moment. You skipped your share of bread last night, didn't you? You gave it to your brother when your mama wasn't looking. Clara's head whipped around. Hannah, what is he talking about? Hannah's face turned beet red. He needed it more, she cried, her voice cracking. What house, Mama? Mr. Harrove is going to take it in 6 weeks. We have no horse, no money, and a stranger bleeding on our floor. I am 12 years old, and I know exactly how much flour we have left, and if I stop counting, I feel like I'm going to start screaming. Clara rushed over and pulled her daughter's hands from the dough, holding them tight as Hannah finally began to sob. Both their hands were sticky with flour. I know you are counting, Clara whispered. I know you are afraid. I am not scared. You are, and it is okay. I am scared, too. A crack appeared in Hannah's tough exterior just for a second. She blinked back tears and turned to the dough, kneading it hard. He still only gets 2 biscuits, she declared. Clara nearly smiled. That evening, the big storm finally gave up. The wind quieted down and the snow stopped for the first time in 4 days. At sundown, Ellie's fever broke. One moment, Clara felt the fire on the child's skin, and the next, it was fading away. Ellie's eyes opened, clear and focused. Mama, I am hungry, she said. Clara buried her face in Ellie's hair and just breathed. Across the room, Eli watched with that raw, unguarded look he tried to hide. He placed a small wooden carving by the stove. It was a horse, simple but perfectly made. An hour later, Sam found it. He looked it over, then looked at Eli. Is this yours? He asked. It can be yours if you like. Sam held the horse up to the firelight, and for the first time since Jim died, his face softened. My daddy used to carve things, Sam said softly. I know, Eli started, then corrected himself. I mean, a man has to pay close attention to make something that good. Sam put the horse in his pocket right beside his hammer. He did not say thank you, but he did not need to. After the children were all asleep, Clara sat across from Eli with the low fire between them. Show me the watch, she said. He froze. His eyes slowly met hers. What watch? The gold one. You were holding it last night when you thought I was asleep. The fire popped in the quiet room. Eli reached into his shirt and pulled it out, placing it on the floor. The firelight made the gold shine with a warm glow. It was a heavy, solid piece. Open it, he said. She picked it up, surprised by its weight. She pressed the stem, and the cover sprang open. The face was white porcelain. Inside the cover, an inscription was carved in the firelight. E.T.B. Build something worth keeping. She set the watch back down. E.T.B., she said. Eli T. Blackwell. What does the B stand for? Beckett, he answered. His face was half in shadow, half in light. My father gave me this watch when I turned 22. He told me to go build something worth keeping. It took me 16 years. I turned 50 head of cattle into 4,000. I turned 2 small shacks into a house with 12 rooms. His hand tightened around the watch. Then a man I trusted ruined it all. Not with fire, but with papers and lies and a crooked judge. Clara just listened. I won it all back, he said. The court saw the truth. He tucked the watch back into his shirt. But I lost everyone I thought was a friend. They only cared about what I had. So you ran away, so I left. I was not even coming here. My horse broke its leg 20 miles out. I walked until I fell. Then a woman with a shotgun found me and gave me her last piece of bread. Clara's heart ached. I need the whole truth, Eli. I have 3 children and only 6 weeks before I lose this home. I do not have time for secrets. You either trust me or you leave when the storm breaks. Eli looked at the woman who had saved him, tended to his wounds, and fed him with bread her own children needed. He looked at her, demanding the one thing he had run from for 2 years, the truth. Not tonight, he said softly. But I will. I give you my word. Your word is not worth much if I do not even know your real name. It is worth everything, he promised. You just do not know it yet. Clara stood up, her knees sore from the cold floor. Soon, she said. Not later. Soon. She went to her bed, lying down beside her children. The fever was gone. Ellie was breathing easy, and Hannah was finally sleeping deep. Sam went to sleep holding a hammer in one hand and his little carved horse in the other. In the quiet dark, Clara listened to Eli getting settled on the floor, his breath slowing down to a steady rhythm. The old cabin groaned in the cold. Sometime deep in the night, she thought she heard him whisper something real low, almost like the wind. She held her breath to hear it better. Build something worth keeping. After that, there was just the sound of the fire turning to embers and the snow starting up again, falling soft and quiet, burying the whole world. The storm finally gave up on the 5th morning. When Clara opened the door, everything was white and completely still. The sky was a low gray blanket, but the snow was done. Eli was already out there, working on the northern stretch of fence that had collapsed under the snow. He was digging out the wire with his bare hands, his left side still bandaged up under his shirt. He'd been at it for 5 days, and her fence stood straighter than it had in years. The woodpile by the door was stacked higher than her head. The chicken coop door, which had hung crooked for a year, now swung shut smooth and quiet. He'd even patched the leak over Ellie's bed with pine tar. He did it all without a word, just seeing what was busted and making it right. Ellie was doing better. Her cough was almost gone, and she ate a whole biscuit that morning. Clara walked out to the fence line, her boots making a crunching sound in the snow. The cold air felt clean and sharp. Eli saw her coming and stood up straight. This fence has seen better days, he said. A good piece of it needs replacing. Posts are rotten out at the base. I know when they should have been replaced, Clara said, her voice tight. My husband was sick, and then he was gone. That left me with 3 kids, 100 things falling apart, and only 2 hands to fix them with. Eli just nodded. He didn't say he was sorry again. He just picked up the wire and got back to his work. Clara watched him for a moment. The road to town should be clear by tomorrow, she said. I'm out of flour and salt. The children need food. I'll go with you. No, she said flatly. You show up in town with me and people will talk. Harrove will hear about it before we even get our supplies. Eli put the wire down and faced her. He's going to hear about it anyway. You think your neighbors haven't noticed the smoke from your chimney all week? They know you were down to your last log 5 days ago. The thought hit Clara like a bucket of ice water. She hadn't considered that. I'll go alone, she insisted. And if Harrove is there, I'll walk right past him just like always with my $18 and 5 weeks left to pay him. Let me help, Eli said, his voice low. You are helping. You're fixing my fence. That ain't what I mean, and you know it, he replied. You want to pay my debt? Just walk into town with your fancy gold watch and secret money and make my problems disappear? Would that be so awful, he asked. Yes, she shot back. It would. Because then I'd owe you, she said, her voice hard as frozen dirt. Then I'm just the widow who couldn't manage on her own, and I'd owe a man who won't even tell me his name. Eli's jaw set. He looked away toward the horizon. Then his eyes met hers again. Beckett, he said. Elijah Thornton Beckett. The name hung in the cold air, but it meant nothing to her. My father, he continued, was Colonel William Beckett. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the Montana Territory. He left it all to me when he died. He picked up a piece of wire, twisting it in his hands. I made it bigger, took on a partner, Marcus Crane, to handle the business end. Then Crane betrayed me. He told every judge and banker from there to Fort Worth that I was a dangerous, unstable man. Also, he could steal the entire operation. Was any of it true? Clara asked, looking him straight in the eye. The violent part, Eli admitted, his voice flat. Rustlers hit the ranch. I fought back and hurt 2 of them pretty bad. Crane used that, said it was proof I was unhinged. Did you win? She asked. I won in court, but I lost everywhere else. Lost every friend I thought I had. He dropped the wire. So I sold the whole ranch and rode south with nothing but that watch and enough money in a Denver bank to buy a small town. Clara felt her breath catch. How much money? Enough. How much? She demanded. $12,000. The number was so big it didn't seem real. Her entire debt was $127. He could pay it off and not even notice it was gone. You crawled to my cabin in a blizzard, she said slowly. Half dead, with no horse, looking like you didn't have a dime to your name. My horse broke her leg about 20 miles out. I walked till the storm hit, and then I just kept walking. Why? I was looking for proof, he said, his eyes finding hers. Proof that someone somewhere would help a stranger with nothing, just because it was the right thing to do. A hot, dangerous feeling rose in Clara's chest. You were testing me. Yes, he said, this whole time. The firewood, the fence, the medicine for Ellie. You were seeing if the poor woman would help a man she thought was poorer than her. He didn't have to answer about the watch. His silence said it all. Without thinking, her hand flew up and cracked across his face. The sound was sharp in the quiet. He took the hit, his head turning from the force of it. Then he faced her again. I deserve that, he said quietly. You deserve worse. Clara's voice shook with rage. My daughter went hungry so we could stretch the flour. My son sleeps with a hammer because he's scared. My baby nearly died just a few feet from where you were hiding a fortune. I know, he whispered. You know? She laughed, a broken, bitter sound. And that makes it all right? No, nothing makes it all right. That's why I didn't just offer you the money. Then why? She demanded. Because everyone who ever helped me wanted something back. His voice cracked for the first time. Every handshake, every smile, it was all about my money. When the lies started and the money was gone, they all vanished. I had to know if one person could be decent. So I was your experiment, she said, her heart aching. You were my last hope, he answered. The words hung between them. She looked at this man who had built an empire, lost it all, and then crawled through a blizzard just to see if a broke widow would share her last piece of bread. You're a fool, Elijah Beckett, she said, her voice softer now. A rich, selfish fool. I am, he agreed. And if you think I'm going to let you pay my debt now out of guilt, you're wrong. Not guilt, he said. A partnership, 50-50. Your land and your hard work against my capital and cattle experience. We build something together, something worth keeping. I don't need a partner, she insisted. You need $127 in 5 weeks, he countered. How are you going to get it? Sell your mama's ring? She stood stiff as a board. She had not breathed a word to him about the ring. Her eyes searched his face, trying to read the truth of it. In the drawer by the bed, he said softly, wrapped in a handkerchief with lace edges. I noticed it that second morning while I was getting the fire going. You were going through my things. The drawer was already open. I saw it, but I never laid a hand on it. That ring is the only thing I have left from my mother. I know. You do not know a single thing about her. I know she made lace by hand. I know the ring is just plain gold, worn down and thin. And I know you wrapped it in the most precious thing she left you, which tells me it meant the world to her, and it means the world to you." Clara's eyes began to burn, but she would not let a tear fall. Not for him. She had used up all her tears the day she pulled Jim from that collapsed mine. There were none left for some rich man playing at being poor on her land. "I'm heading to town tomorrow," she stated. "By myself. When I return, I expect you to be gone." She turned on her heel and walked to the cabin. "Clara." She did not stop. "I will leave if that is what you truly want. But let me at least leave enough to settle the debt. Call it whatever you want, just let me do this." She paused on the porch, her hand gripping the rail Eli had fixed just 3 days earlier. "It was solid work, like everything he did. That is not how this is going to work," she said, her back still to him. "You do not get to fool me for 5 days and then try to buy your way out of it. Then you tell me how it works." She stepped inside and shut the door. Hannah stood by the table, and Clara could tell from her face that she had heard it all. "He is a rich man," Hannah said. "He is? And this whole time?" "Yes. He just watched us nearly starve. He brought Ellie that tea bark." After he watched us nearly starve, Hannah's voice was cold as ice. "He could have helped us from the very start, but he just watched us like we were some kind of show." Clara did not have an answer, because her daughter was right. "I want him gone," Hannah said. "He will be gone tomorrow. I want him gone right now, Mama. Now, before Ellie gets too fond of him. Before Sam." She trailed off, her gaze falling on Sam's pocket, where the little wooden horse had been for 3 days, the toy his hand always found when he was scared or lonely. "Oh," Hannah breathed, a terrible understanding dawning on her. "Sam does not know." "Oh, he knows," Clara said quietly. "He just does not care. Someone made him a horse, and that is the first gift anyone has given that boy since his daddy died." Clara sank into a chair at the table, burying her face in her hands. The wood, once smoothed by her husband Jim, was now rough and raw from years of scrubbing. Everything gets worn down in the end. "Mama." Hannah's small, strong hand came to rest on her shoulder. "What are we going to do?" "I do not know, honey. You always know." "Not this time." They sat in the silence, the fire crackling nearby. Sam was on the bed, making the wooden horse gallop along the windowsill, whispering stories only he could hear. Hoofbeats. Clara's head shot up. Hannah rushed to the window, her expression changing. "Mama, there are riders coming." Clara moved to her side. 2 men on horseback were coming up the road from the south, moving slow but steady through the snow. One was on a big bay horse she knew well. Hargrove's horse. "Get away from the window," Clara ordered. "Take the children to the back corner and be quiet." "Mama." "Do it now, Hannah." Hannah quickly gathered the children and hustled them to the corner behind the stove. Sam clutched his horse. Clara grabbed the shotgun. 2 shells. She had been saving them for a rabbit. The front door swung open and Eli was there, his face grim. 2 riders, he said. "Coming from the south. I see them. One of them is on Hargrove's horse." Eli's eyes darted from the shotgun in her hands to her determined face. "Let me handle this. This is my land," Clara replied. "My land, my door, and my fight." He looked at her for a long, hard moment, then stepped to the side. Not behind her, but right beside her, their shoulders almost touching. His hand found the hammer he had left on a shelf. "Your fight," he said, "but I'm standing with you." The riders reached the gate. The larger man on Hargrove's horse got down first. It was not Hargrove, but his foreman, Burl Kendrick. 240 pounds of pure Texas mean. The second man stayed on his horse, a long rifle resting across his saddle. Kendrick strode up the path like he owned it. Clara stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held ready. Kendrick stopped 10 feet away, his eyes flicking between Clara and Eli. He had not expected to find another man here. "Mrs. Mallister?" "Mr. Kendrick. Judge Hargrove sends his best. Just wanted to see if you made it through the storm okay." "We made it just fine. Good to hear. Real good." His gaze settled on Eli again. Got company, I see. That is none of your business. No, ma'am, it surely is not. Just making conversation. He reached into his coat and Clara's grip on the shotgun tightened. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. The judge wanted me to deliver this myself. He held it out to her. Clara did not budge. Set it on the gatepost, she said. Kendrick gave a yellow-toothed smile. Now, Mrs. Mallister, no need to be unfriendly. The judge is just trying to help. Set it on the post and then you can leave. The smile vanished from his eyes. He gave Eli one last sizing-up look, then walked back, placed the paper on the post, and rode off with his man. Clara waited until they were gone before she walked to the gate and unfolded the paper. She had to read it twice for the words to sink in. Eli came down from the porch. "What is it?" Clara folded the paper and went back inside, sitting at the table. He moved the date up. Her voice was flat and empty. "The tax sale has been moved from January 15th to December 23rd. That is 3 weeks from now. The day before Christmas Eve." Eli stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across the paper. "He cannot do that," Eli said. "There is a 30-day notice requirement. Moving the date up like that is against the law." Clara looked up at him. "And now you know tax law, too. I know enough. But it does not matter what the law says when Hargrove is the law. He runs the whole show." 3 weeks, she said, smoothing the paper on the table. "Not 5, 3. 21 days, Hannah whispered from the corner. 21 days and the $18 in the coffee tin was all they had against a debt of 127. Eli sat down across from her. "Let me help." "No." "Clara, you have got 3 weeks." I said no. "Your pride is going to make your children homeless." The words stung worse than a slap because she knew they were true. "Get out," she whispered. "No. I told you to be gone. And I am telling you I am not going. This is not your fight. You are right. It is not. It is yours." He leaned in closer. "But I am making it mine, not because you asked me to. I am doing it because your little girl fought off a fever that should have taken her, because your boy sleeps with a hammer for protection, and because your 12-year-old daughter skips meals so her brother has more to eat." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I am doing it because you pointed a shotgun at a stranger, then brought him inside and fed him when you had nothing to spare. And I will not stand by and let a man like Hargrove take this home away from you." 3 days before Christmas, Clara felt her throat tighten. From the corner, Sam's small voice cut through the silence. "Mama, let him help." Clara opened her eyes. Her son stood there, hammer in one hand and the wooden horse in the other, his gaze steady. "Daddy would have let him help," Sam said. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. Clara looked from the notice on the table to her children, then to Eli, whose face held something she was finally starting to trust. "Partners," she said, the word feeling rough in her throat. "Not a handout. Partners. Equal, or it is nothing. Equal. You provide the money, I provide the land and all the work I have put into this place. An even trade, and you tell me everything. No more secrets. No more watching my family suffer. Everything. And if you ever betray me," her voice dropped to a low growl, "if you turn out to be just another man who lies and takes, I will find you. And this time, the shotgun will not be empty." Eli reached his hand across the table. His knuckles were scarred, his fingers strong. It was the same hand that had carved a horse for her son. He laid his calloused hands right there on the table, a silent promise of his hard work. Clara put her hand on his, a grip as solid as oak. Hannah came next, her small hand covering theirs. Her eyes, though wet, held a fire as she looked at Eli. She told him plain, "I'll be watching you. You hurt my mama, and you'll answer to me." Eli saw the grit in that 12-year-old girl and nodded with a truth he couldn't fake. "I believe you," he said. Little Sam placed his hammer by their hands and added his own small fingers to the pile. Partners. On the bed, Ellie's breathing finally eased into a deep, healing sleep. The snow started again. blanketing the world in quiet. Long before dawn, Eli rode out. Clara lay there, feeling the warmth of her daughter beside her, and an emptiness in her chest she called hunger. He had paid for his horse with cash from a money belt she never knew he had, a secret stash of money he wore while she was busy trying to make their flour last one more day. She rose and tended to the cabin, but his presence was everywhere. The firewood he'd stacked, the water he'd hauled, the cornmeal he'd bought. Every small comfort was a reminder of his help. Hannah watched her, her young face full of worry. "He said he'd be back," the girl stated. "Men say a lot of things, Hannah. Your daddy said he'd be back too." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Clara's hand froze on the coffee pot. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I know," Hannah's voice was small. "I just don't want you to get hurt." Clara went to her daughter, putting an arm around her stiff shoulders. "If he comes back," Clara said, "we'll figure it out. And if he don't, we'll figure that out too. Just like always." For 3 long days, there was no sign of Eli. Clara tried to fix the fence herself, her hands bleeding from the sharp wire until the pain in her back forced her to stop. On the second day, Agnes Whitmore showed up. 60 years old and tough as a fence post, she walked in carrying a basket and a look that missed nothing. "Heard you had company," Agnes said, her eyes taking in the extra bedroll and the neatly stacked firewood. "Had company," Clara confirmed. "He's gone now." Agnes checked on Ellie, her knowing hands feeling the girl's forehead. "This child's been taking willow bark tea," she declared. "And I know for a fact you were fresh out." She looked Clara straight in the eye. "So a man shows up in a blizzard and just happens to find some for you." Clara poured the coffee. "His name is Eli. Found him near Frozen in the storm. He's gone to town." Agnes just smiled. "Funny thing. Burl Kendrick is telling everyone at the saloon that Widow Mallister has a man now, and a stranger just bought a horse and sent 4 telegrams, paying with silver dollars." Clara's heart sank. She told Agnes everything then, from the fancy watch to the man's full name. Elijah Thornton Beckett. Agnes listened, her face unreadable. When Clara was done, the old woman finally spoke. "Beckett. I heard that name. His family had a cattle empire up in Montana. Then the son just walked away from it all." She leaned in close. "And now he's here, fixing your fence. The real question is, what does it matter? Harrove moved up the foreclosure. It ain't 3 weeks. It's 12 days. The coffee in Clara's cup went cold. Agnes stood to leave. "I've seen Harrove ruin 6 families. They're all gone. Their land bought for practically nothing." She paused at the door. "If this Beckett fellow is for real and he's ready for a fight, then let him fight. Not just for you, but for all of us." The door closed, leaving Clara alone with the ticking clock. 12 days, December 23rd. Sam sat beside her, pushing a little wooden horse across the table toward the door. "He's coming back," the boy said with certainty. "The horse knows. Horses always find their way home." On the 10th day, Eli came back. He rode in from the south, leading another horse loaded with supplies. Behind him was a stranger, a thin man in a fine black coat who looked like he belonged in a city office. Eli opened the gate with the same careful hands as before. Clara just stared at him, a storm of relief and anger swirling inside her. "You were gone 10 days, she said, her voice flat. "I know," he replied. "You said a few days. Things got complicated." "What things?" Eli motioned to the other man. "Clara, this is Mr. Aldous Fletcher. He is a lawyer from Denver." The man tipped his hat. "Mrs. Mallister, your partner has explained your predicament to me." Clara's eyes shot to Eli. "Partner? Is that what you're calling yourself after leaving me here for 10 days with my children? 12 days from losing everything?" Eli didn't argue. He just stood there and took her anger, knowing she had earned the right to it. The lawyer cleared his throat. Perhaps we could go inside. I have some papers that need your signature. Inside, Mr. Fletcher laid out a stack of documents filled with legal words. Mr. Beckett hired my firm 5 days ago, he explained. We have filed an emergency appeal with the court to challenge the assessment on your land. We also filed a complaint about some very questionable tax auctions in this county. What does that mean in plain English? Clara asked. It means Judge Hargrove has some explaining to do, Fletcher said, adjusting his glasses. Your land was valued at 3 times what it should be. 5 other families had the same thing happen, and every single one of those properties was bought by someone connected to the bank the judge controls. That's not exactly news around here, Clara said bitterly. No, ma'am, Fletcher agreed. But it is news to the territorial governor. He received my report yesterday along with a petition signed by 18 other families who lost their land the same way. Clara looked up, stunned. 18? Mrs. Whitmore was a great help in finding them, the lawyer added with a small smile. That remarkable woman rode for 2 days gathering signatures and statements. She told me to tell you, this fight ain't just yours anymore. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. So what happens now? She asked. Now, Fletcher said, packing his papers, we go to a court Judge Hargrove doesn't own. The December 23rd auction cannot happen. It cannot proceed? Clara repeated the words, hardly believing them. You mean he cannot sell my land? Not until the court makes a ruling, and that could take months. The relief washed over her so hard the room began to spin, and she grabbed the table to steady herself. Eli's hand touched her shoulder, but she pulled away. I am fine, she said, even though she was shaking. She walked out onto the porch and took a deep breath of cold air. Her land was still her land. For today it was safe. Eli came out and stood near the door, giving her space. You should have told me you were bringing a lawyer, she said. Would you have let me? That is not the point. It is the whole point. You would have said no. You think I do not know I'm in trouble? You think I do not know I cannot do this by myself? I have known it every single day for 2 years. But I get up anyway. I feed my children anyway. I fix what I can and pray about what I cannot, because that is all I have. Her voice was trembling, but she forced it to be steady. Do not you dare tell me I need help. I know that better than anybody. While you were drifting all over the country feeling sorry for yourself, I was living through this nightmare. The words hit him hard, and he just stood there and took them. You are right, he said in a low voice. I was pathetic. Then why in the world did you stop here? Because you aimed a shotgun right at my chest. He moved a little closer. Because I saw your little girl give her own bread to her brother. I saw you fighting for a sick baby and still find a place for a stranger. The games all stopped the day you slapped me. How am I supposed to believe that? Because I rode through a blizzard to bring a lawyer for a woman who just told me she does not want my help. I slapped you, she stated, right in front of my children. Hannah thought it was a fine idea. A rough laugh escaped from Clara before she could hold it back. This is not funny. No, ma'am. Stop calling me ma'am. Clara. So there is $12,000 in a bank in Denver, and you came through a snowstorm with it? That sounds completely crazy. It was, he admitted. You said we would be partners. I did. Equal partners. My land and your money. We build something together, a 50-50 split. That is the agreement. And if we manage to beat Hargrove, then we build. We can start small, maybe 30 head of cattle. We can hire a couple of good hands and put up a proper barn. With what money? The $12,000 will be enough to start. Clara leaned against the porch post with her arms crossed. And you plan on staying, if you will have me? Doing what? Living on my porch forever? I will build a bunkhouse. I am only asking for a chance to work hard, a chance to build something that will last. My children are everything to me, she said. They come before this ranch, and they come before you. I would not want it any other way. Hannah is a smart girl, and she does not trust you. And Sam, he is looking for a father in you. I know. I can never be that for him, but I can be a man who is here every single morning. A man who keeps his word. I came back this time, Clara. I will always come back. I give you my word. The door creaked open. Hannah stood there. Mr. Fletcher needs Mama to sign 7 papers. I will be right in, Clara said. Hannah gave Eli one last hard look. There are 2 biscuits left on the stove for you. Then she went inside. Did she just offer me food? Eli whispered. Do not make a big deal out of it, Clara warned. Inside, Fletcher had the documents laid out. Clara signed her name 7 times. Her hand was shaking, and she hated how her writing looked so small and childish. Eli stood by, quiet and patient. When she finished, Fletcher put the papers away. I will get these filed in Denver. The freeze order will be in place within 2 days. Hargrove is going to be mad, Clara said. Fletcher allowed himself a small smile. That is exactly what we are counting on. Angry men make mistakes. Fletcher tipped his hat to Clara, gave a nod to Eli, and rode off into the biting cold. Clara watched from the window as his shape got smaller and smaller against the snow until he vanished over a ridge. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd been all alone. Now Eli stood by the stove, looking at a biscuit Hannah gave him like it was pure gold. He told her, "You are not alone anymore." Then, from the corner, Ellie's voice came through, clearer than it had been in weeks. "Mama, I am hungry." A real laugh, deep and honest, bubbled up from a place Clara had forgotten. She went to the shelf for Eli's good flour and started making biscuits. Sam was on the floor, showing Eli the little wooden horse he had, explaining how it surely needed a saddle and maybe a barn. Eli listened with his whole attention, the way he did everything, the 2 of them planning something important together. Hannah stood watch at the window, her face set and her eyes sharp, ready for whatever Hargrove sent their way. Clara's hands were strong and sure as she worked the biscuit dough. It was the one thing she always knew how to do, make something from almost nothing. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and a tiny sliver of blue sky appeared on the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was a promise that the real sky was still there. She put the biscuits in the oven and stood listening to her family. Her daughter was a lookout, her son was making plans, her youngest was asking for more food, and a man she was just starting to trust was laughing with her boy. There were 12 days until they had to be at the courthouse. 12 days until Hargrove made his play. 12 days to see if everything she had would stand or fall. The courthouse was so cold, Clara could feel it right through her boots and the black wool dress she hadn't worn since her husband Jim's funeral. The dress smelled of cedar and sorrow. It was December 23rd, 9 o'clock in the morning. Fletcher had gotten the court order to stop the auction 8 days ago, but Hargrove just plain ignored it. 3 days ago, a notice was nailed to the courthouse door, declaring the tax auction would happen as scheduled. Hargrove was pushing ahead, daring anybody to stand up to him. Fletcher rode hard from Denver and got to their cabin last night, his face tight and tired. He had copies of the freeze order, all stamped and sealed. "He is just bluffing," Fletcher said, spreading the papers on her table. "This order is binding. If he holds that auction, every sale will be worthless." Clara told him, "He does not care if it is worthless. He just wants to scare folks into giving up their land." Now she stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, breathing white clouds into the cold, still air. A bigger crowd than she expected was gathering, maybe 40 people. She saw Agnes Whitmore looking ready for a fight, standing beside 2 women Clara hadn't seen in months. There was Widow Johnson and Mrs. Hendricks, who had both lost their land to Hargrove. They had come back to either watch or to fight. Eli stood beside Clara, not touching her, but just there. He wore a fine 3-piece suit with a gold watch chain, looking like the powerful cattleman he was. He looked like he came from a different world, a world with choices. Clara hated that suit. "Are you ready?" he asked her. She told him no. He said, "Me neither." Hannah stood on her other side, her dress sleeves a little too short. She had braided her own hair that morning. Sam had given her the small wooden horse for good luck, and she could feel its smooth shape in her pocket. The courthouse door creaked open, and Burl Kendrick stepped out. His mean eyes scanned the crowd and landed right on Clara and Eli. "The auction starts in 10 minutes, he announced. Fletcher walked up the steps holding a leather case and a sealed envelope. "I need to see Judge Hargrove," he said. Kendrick blocked his way, saying, "The judge is busy." Fletcher held up the court order. "I have an order from the territorial court to stop all tax auctions in this county. If Judge Hargrove goes through with this, he'll be in contempt of court. You should probably give this to him." Kendrick looked from the envelope to Fletcher, then down at Eli. He grumbled, "Wait here," and took the letter inside. The crowd started whispering. Agnes moved closer to Clara. 18 signatures, she said quietly. "Every last one of them is here today." People came from all over. Clara looked out at the faces of folks who had lost everything to the man inside that courthouse. "They came," Clara whispered. Agnes replied, "Of course they came. This was never just about you." The door opened again, and Judge Hargrove himself stepped out. He was a big, heavy man with a face full of red veins. His eyes found Clara, then Eli, then swept over the whole crowd. He held Fletcher's unopened envelope in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "this auction will proceed as planned. Judge Hargrove," Fletcher stepped forward, "I have delivered a certified freeze order." Hargrove held up the envelope and said, "I have received your paper, Mr. Fletcher, and I will give it all the consideration it deserves." Then he set it down on the railing, still sealed. "This is a county matter, handled by county laws. The territorial court has no say here." Fletcher tried to argue, "That is incorrect, Your Honor," but Hargrove cut him off. "You are not licensed to practice in this county, Mr. Fletcher. This auction is proceeding." Fletcher looked at Clara, his eyes telling her that Hargrove was going to push right through and she needed to be ready. The clerk unrolled a paper and started. "First parcel, the Mallister property, 160 acres. Tax debt of $42 outstanding." Clara's heart pounded. She squeezed the wooden horse in her pocket. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the clerk asked. $50, Kendrick shouted from the top of the steps, bidding for Hargrove like always. Clara glanced at Eli. He was watching Hargrove with a calm, calculating look on his face. "I have 50. Do I hear 60? $150. Eli's voice was clear and strong, and every head in the crowd turned. "Who is bidding?" the clerk stammered. Eli walked slowly up the steps and stopped right in front of him. "Elijah Thornton Beckett, of the Beckett Cattle Company, Fort Worth and Denver." He handed the clerk his card. "I am bidding for Mrs. Clara Mallister, the rightful owner. $150 will clear all her debts, including the taxes and the banknote." The clerk's hands began to shake. Hargrove stepped forward. "This auction is for tax debt only," he snapped. Eli's voice was level. "The banknote is held by your bank, Judge, the same First National Bank where you hold the controlling interest. You have been buying every foreclosed property in this county using fake companies connected to your own family." The crowd began to murmur. "You are out of order, sir." Hargrove's face turned beet red. "I am a bidder at a public auction," Eli said calmly. He pulled out a roll of cash and counted it out slowly. $150. Her debts are now settled. The auction is void. This auction is not void until I say it is." Eli stared right at him. "I looked into it. I found the tax assessments. Your personal ranch was valued at $1.25 an acre. But the assessment for Clara's land was $4 an acre. And Widow Johnson's was $3.75. Your own brother-in-law did every single assessment. Every one of those properties ended up with a holding company registered in your wife's name." The courthouse steps went completely silent. "These are baseless accusations," Hargrove sputtered. "They are documented facts," Eli said, holding up a file. "And copies have been filed with the territorial court. The territorial marshal is already in town. He is at the hotel right now waiting to discuss these papers with you." All the color drained from Hargrove's face. "You are bluffing. I was in the cattle business for 16 years. A man who bluffs in that business loses his entire herd. Eli stepped closer, his voice low. Walk away. Cancel this auction and resign your position. The marshal will still investigate, but if you cooperate, we will not push for criminal charges. That is the best deal you are going to get. You have no idea what you have just done, Hargrove whispered. Oh, I know exactly what I have done, Eli answered. I did the same thing Ms. Mallister did when she aimed that shotgun at me. I chose which side I was on. Hargrove glared past Eli at Clara, and at the crowd of people he had cheated standing right behind her. This is not over. For you, it is. Hargrove spun around and walked back inside the courthouse. The clerk, standing all alone on the steps, cleared his throat. This auction is suspended, he said, his voice cracking. All tax actions in this county are frozen pending a review. The crowd let out a huge roar. Agnes squeezed Clara's arm, and Widow Johnson started crying with joy. Clara just stood there, frozen, feeling the little wooden horse in her pocket. Eli walked down the steps to her, his face tired, as if the whole fight had cost him dearly. It is done, he said. Clara could not find any words. You just stood up to a judge in front of this whole town. I did it for all of us, he said, nodding toward the crowd. He meant Agnes and Widow Johnson and all the other folks who had come to fight back. Hannah, who had been standing quietly behind her mother, stepped forward. She looked at Eli for a long time. Then she held out her hand. Eli looked at her serious face, then took her small hand and gave it one firm, businesslike shake. You still only get 2 biscuits, Hannah told him. A real smile finally broke across Eli's face, like a man who had been holding his breath for years could finally let it all out. Yes, ma'am, he said. They rode home in the afternoon. Clara and Hannah were on the mare Eli had brought, and Eli rode the gelding. The road was quiet and white. Clara watched the 2 sets of hoof prints their horses left in the snow. For 3 long years, there had only ever been one. They didn't speak much after that. The silence was different now, filled with a shared understanding. When they topped the hill and saw the cabin, with smoke curling from the chimney, Sam burst out the door, not even stopping to put on his shoes. He ran right through the snow, waving a hammer. Mama, Ellie ate 3 biscuits. Clara slid off the horse and swung him into her arms, hugging him tight. 3 whole biscuits? She laughed. Inside, Ellie was sitting up in bed. Her cheeks had color and her eyes were bright. She held up her arms. Mama. Clara gathered her sick little girl into a hug, breathing in the smell of her hair. Ellie was warm, not with a fever, but with life. She was alive. Hannah was already at the stove, putting a kettle on, moving with a purpose they hadn't seen in a long, long time. Eli had fetched the supplies, flour, salt, lard, and coffee beans. Clara's hands were quick and sure as she measured and mixed. Her face was calm. The hard line of her jaw finally eased after so many months. Eli just stood in the doorway, halfway in and halfway out, waiting. Clara looked up at him. You are letting all the cold air in, she said. He stepped inside and shut the door. That night, for the first time in a long time, they all sat around the table for a proper meal. Clara had whipped up biscuits and gravy from real flour. Eli brewed some dark, strong coffee. Little Ellie sat on Clara's lap, picking at a biscuit. Sam talked Eli's ear off about a wooden horse and the barn it needed. Hannah, quiet as ever, had set 5 places at the table without being asked. Clara saw it but said nothing. After they ate, Eli went out to the porch. Clara put the little ones to bed. She found him sitting in one of 2 chairs. She had never owned 2 chairs before he fixed the broken one. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than a person could count. The cold air smelled clean like pine trees and snow. Fletcher reckons the court case could take 6 months, Eli said. Maybe longer. It might get nasty. Hardgroves has friends. So do I, it seems, Clara answered. Their chairs rocked, close but not quite touching. Come spring, Eli said. I am thinking of bringing 30 head of cattle up from Denver. We can see how the land takes to grazing. We could build that barn in April if the snow melts. They made plans, talking low, the way they had that first night. But this time was different. This time it felt like it could all come true. Clara asked him about his watch, about the words carved in it. "Build something worth keeping," he said. "They were my father's words. He was talking about land and cattle. But I think he meant you should hold on tight to whatever you are most afraid to lose." "I was most afraid of losing this place," Clara said. "This cabin, this land, this—" She looked at him then, his profile against the night sky. "Now I am afraid of losing more things," she said, "which means I have more worth keeping." Eli's hand reached across the small space between them and found hers. His palm was rough and warm. From inside, Sam's sleepy voice drifted out. "Mama, the horse needs a name." "Go to sleep, Sam." "But it needs a name." "Can I name it Eli?" A quiet stillness settled on the porch. Clara saw something raw and unguarded in Eli's face, something she only ever saw around her children. "You can name it whatever you want, sweet boy," Clara said. "His name is Eli." The boy's breathing went quiet as he fell asleep. Eli's hand tightened on hers, just enough. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I know. Not tomorrow, and not when the snow melts. This porch, this chair, this hand, this is where I want to be." Clara looked out at her land. Their land. Everything was covered in a clean white blanket, the way snow makes the world feel brand new, as if all the bad things get buried under something quiet and pure. "Then stay," she said. The stars wheeled overhead. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady, banked for the night. On the porch, 2 rocking chairs moved in a steady rhythm. 2 people held hands against the cold. And inside, 3 children slept safe in their home, a home no one could take from them now. Tomorrow would bring work, fences to fix, a barn to plan, and a fight to win. But tonight, there was just this: 2 chairs, 2 hands, and stars so thick they looked like spilled flour across a dark table. A story like this one stays with you, long after it is over. Not because it has a perfect ending, because nothing ever does, but because you see a little bit of yourself in it. Maybe you have felt like Clara, trying to hold on to what little you have. Or maybe you have been Eli, building walls around your heart because trusting someone felt too risky. Maybe you were Hannah, a child forced to carry burdens meant for grown-ups. Or maybe you were Sam, just waiting for someone good to finally stay. We have all wondered if kindness still means something, or if we were fools for believing in it. This story just reminds us that we are not alone in asking. Thank you for listening. And if you have ever given your last piece of bread to a stranger, or been that stranger who needed it, I hope you know that it mattered. It always matters. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.